Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I am O'Martin, and I would like to welcome you to the first official episode of Tanks for the Memories, a new series where we explore the history of our favorite tanks from gaming. First, I would like to welcome everyone that subscribed after the Mighty Jingles video contest. Thanks for subscribing. I hope you all enjoy this. I figured first episode, let's do a Tier 1 tank. So this week, it is the American Tier 1 light tank, the T1 Cunningham. The single T1 prototype was constructed in 1927. Its primary weapon was a 37mm M1918 short tank gun. This was a US version of a World War I era French infantry support gun. It was a low-velocity weapon with a muzzle velocity of 1,200 feet per second. The prototype's armor ranged from 6.4mm at its thinnest to 9.5mm at its thickest. The T1 weighed in at 6.8 metric tons and was powered by the 105 horsepower V8 Cunningham engine. This gave the T1 prototype a top speed of 20 miles per hour. After evaluation by the US military, the T1 prototype was stripped down to the chassis, and the chassis would be reused in future testing. Most future versions of the T1 series would share the same basic layout, with the engine mounted in the front and the turret, the transmission, and final drive located in the rear. The exceptions would be the T1E4 and T1E6, which would move the turret to the middle, the engine to the rear, and the transmission and final drive to the front. A configuration that would be similar to later tanks. All T1 versions had a hand crank turn. Trust me, this sucks as much as it sounds like it would. Armed with a 37mm main gun and a coaxially mounted 30 caliber Browning machine gun, and all carried a crew of 2, a commander who sat within the turret and worked the guns, and a driver seated just in front of the turret. The T1 prototype would be followed in 1928 by the very similar T1E1. 4 of these were built, making the T1E1 the only T1 version which was not built as a single prototype. The T1E1 was briefly standardized for production as the light tank M1, but this was revoked after only a couple of months. The T1E1 had a few minor changes from the T1. The hull no longer projected forward of the tracks, and the fuel tanks were moved above the tracks. The top speed was reduced to 18 miles per hour. The next version, the T1E2, was built in 1929, again as a single prototype. It had heavier armor varying from 6.4mm to 15.9mm thick, and the tank's weight rose to 8.1 tons. The Cunningham V8 engine had its power boosted to 132 horsepower, giving the T1E2 a slightly higher power-to-weight ratio than its predecessors. Despite this, the maximum speed was only 16 miles per hour because of changes in the gear ratios. The 37mm main gun was changed to a long-barreled Browning semi-automatic type, having a much higher muzzle velocity of 2,000 feet per second, though later the old M1918 model was reinstalled. In 1930, the U.S. Ordnance Department modified one of the T1E1 tanks to create the T1E3. In some ways, this was a hybrid of the T1E1 and the T1E2. It had the high-velocity, long-barreled Browning gun, thickened armor, and more powerful engine of the T1E2, but it retained the hull, turret, dimensions, and transmission gear ratios of the T1E1. The T1E3 weighed 7.7 tons. Since it had the T1E2's more powerful engine and the T1E1 gearing, this gave it both a higher power-to-weight ratio and greater speed than any previous T1 version, with a maximum speed of 21.9 miles per hour. The most important feature of this version, however, was its suspension, which was completely redesigned. All previous T1 versions had a totally unsprung suspension which used multiple equalizing links to spread out impacts from rough terrain. This still gave a very rough ride. The T1E3 suspension had coil springs and hydraulic shock absorbers, and its ride was smoother. The T1E4, introduced in 1932, was another alteration of a T1E1 tank. Its transformation was, however, more radical, because the vehicle's layout was completely changed. The engine was moved to the rear, the transmission and final drive to the front, and the turret to the middle of the body. At 15 feet 5 inches in length, the T1E4 was nearly a quarter again as long as preceding T1 versions. The T1E4 also got new suspension, in this case using semi-elliptic leaf springs and articulated four-wheeled bogies. This suspension was similar to that of the British Vickers T6 light tank, which the Army had recently tested. The main gun was replaced by the 37mm semi-automatic gun M1924. With a muzzle velocity of 1,350 feet per second, it was lower than that of the long-barreled Browning in the T1E2 and T1E3. The armor thickness was similar to the T1E2 and the T1E3. The T1E4 had an overall weight of 7.8 metric tons. At first, the T1E4 retained the engine from the T1E1, but this proved to be underpowered, so it was replaced by an improved Cunningham V8 producing 140 horsepower, giving the T1E4 a top speed of 20 miles per hour. The T1E5, introduced around the same time as the T1E4, was yet another conversion of a T1E1, in this case with a new steering system. All previous T1 versions used a simple clutch brake steering system, which led to a loss of power while turning. The T1E5 replaced this with a controlled differential steering system from the Cleveland Tractor Company. The engine was also replaced with the same 140 horsepower version as the T1E4. Testing showed the controlled differential steering to be clearly superior to the clutch braking system, and the Ordnance Department recommended its use for all tracked vehicles that could exceed 6 miles per hour. The final T1 version produced, the T1E6, was introduced in 1932 as a further alteration of the T1E4. The Cunningham V8 engine was replaced with a 244 horsepower V12 made by the American LaFrance and Formite Corporation. Even though the tank's weight increased to 9.03 tons, its more powerful engine gave it the best power-to-weight ratio of the entire T1 series. However, the maximum speed was still 20 miles per hour, and the larger V12 engine severely crowded the engine bay, making maintenance troublesome. The T1E6 kept the armament of the T1E4. The armor's maximum thickness remained unchanged, but the minimum thickness would increase from 6.4 millimeters to 9.5. While the T1 Cunningham would never see active combat service, its multiple prototypes would teach the U.S. military many lessons that would be used in future tank designs. Today, the T1E2 has been preserved without its guns. It was an outdoor display at the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Aberdeen, Maryland, until the museum was closed in 2010. It was then moved to the U.S. Army Ordnance Training and Heritage Center in Fort Lee, Virginia, and it is currently in indoor storage and not accessible to the public. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe, as I will be making a new episode every week. Also, if there is a tank that you would like for me to do a video on, leave a message in the comments section below. Since I'm a new player to World of Tanks, I don't have access to all the tanks, so if you would like to send me a replay or two of tanks you would like me to do, my email is in the description below. Have fun on the battlefield, and I will see you all next time.